Welcome everybody to this meeting of Left Horizons. We're very pleased today to welcome a distinguished guest speaker. It's Michael Roberts, who has worked as a City of London economist for decades and managed to combine that with a career in writing for Marxist newspapers and writing Marxist economics books. In particular, more recently, he's written the Great Recession in 2009 and the Long Depression in 2016, and very many other books before and since that. And he's constantly speaking on the internet and contributing to journals. And if you're a regular reader of Left Horizons' website, you'll see plenty of articles by Michael, which we share on that as well. So it's really pleased to have him with us. And with that, I'll ask him to speak on the eternal mystery of Mr. Trump and his tariffs. And, whether they're on or off, I don't know. I haven't checked in the last 10 minutes, but perhaps Michael's been keeping his tabs on it, and we'll find out. So off you go, Michael, to speak for about between 20 and 30 minutes.
So yes, it's I think, as John Pickard said when he sent me an email, it's like a circus we're watching at the moment, with the President of the United States, POTUS, appearing on Twitter, or was X, and all the rest of it, and on TV and with interviews, with all kinds of wild things coming out of his mouth. But in particular, the plan which the Trump and his advisors in the White House have decided is the real way forward to make America great again, which is to introduce tariffs, if you like, taxes on imports coming into the United States from all around the rest of the world, and to use that as a weapon in their eyes to try and change the structure of the world trade in the interest of the United States and also industry, and also provide, he says, revenues that he can then use to cut taxes for corporations so that they've got the incentive to invest and build new manufacturing and other installations in the United States and make it greater again. This circus has now been going on for several weeks, in particular, in the last few weeks. And there has been a sort of a pause at the moment. We have a 90-day pause, according to President, before he considers further measures. During this period, he tells us that 70 countries have phoned him up and said that they're desperate to do a deal with him rather than face the shocking tariffs that are going to be placed on their exports to the United States. Here is the first graph. I think you should take a look at it. If you can see that fairly clearly, you can see we're going back here. This is the effective tariff rate which Trump and his pals have put on all imports coming into the United States. You can see that over the years, I don't know if you can read that very well, but the tariff rates across the world in all the major economies have come down very sharply. That's 1900, when they were last introduced by President McKinley, who is Trump's hero in the late 19th century. And then we get a big fall in tariffs. And then during the 1930s, we had a new range of tariffs under two congressmen, Smoot-Hawley, who introduced that for the United States. And that drove the effective tariff rate up to around about 20%. Then in the post-war period, the period of free trade, globalization, international trade agreements, you see that the tariff rate fell down to virtually nothing by the time we got to the beginning of the 21st century, well below 5% on average, about 3% across the world. Different tariffs on different sectors, but if you want to average it out, it's around about 3%. So with the victory of Trump in the election at the end of 2024 and in the beginning of 2025, the first big measure he's made on the international front is to introduce a range of tariffs and a 10% baseline on all tariffs. And then China has got a series of escalating tariffs, which were started under Biden. You can just see a little bump there, but have now dramatically been increased by Trump, I think current figure is about 125% on all imports from China into the United States, 125%. But we now have exemptions, the exemption being on consumer electronics coming out of China. So Apple computers, iPhones, other smart TVs and things that China produces in their country, but are produced by American companies who will be severely hit by this huge increase in tariffs. They've been exempt, at least for the moment. But there are still other tariffs, 25% on steel, aluminium, autos, and so on, which affects Canada and other countries. But if you just look at where we've gone from just before Trump comes in, now we're up to basically an effective average tariff rate of around about 20%, which matches what it was under Smoot-Hawley back in the 1930s. So these rates are now, on average, the US is charging tariffs on all imports at the highest level it's been in 100 years. And that's the indication of how significantly changed it is from free trade to protectionism in spades, as far as the MAGA and the Trump is concerned. And why does he want to do this? What's the purpose of this exercise? Well, he says it's because if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, that the United States is running a huge deficit with all the other countries in the world, currently at around about 125 billion a month. It's dramatically increased in the recent period. And he says that this is a complete rip-off. This is people stealing money from the Americans by introducing all kinds of unfair measures against American exports. And on the other hand, America is just allowing all this stuff to come into the country and destroying American industry and destroying American trade. So he's going to liberate American industry by raising the cost of importing foreign goods for American companies and households, reducing demand maybe, but it's a price you have to pay. But a huge trade deficit will then be reduced, and it will force foreign companies either to cut their costs or do a deal with him, or actually invest in the United States and operate within the US rather than export to it. And perhaps American companies who've gone abroad will also do the same, and they will come back to the USA and start rebuilding all those Rust Belt states which have lost all their manufacturing base. So the aim is to close that deficit. According to what some of them are saying, it's going to continue until the deficit is zero. So given the fact that the USA has run a trade deficit since 1975, that is really an ambitious project. So he's introduced reciprocal tariffs on every country in the world, and it's now at a 10% level. It doesn't matter whether you're running a surplus with the United States or a deficit with the United States, you will pay the tariffs. And that includes the penguins of McDonald and Heard Island, who have been specifically complaining about the fact that they're being charged a tariff when they don't actually export anything at all to the United States. But every country has been covered, which gives you an indication, by the way, of how can I put it, the 12-year-old skills of White House in actually working out how to introduce tariffs that specifically would hit different countries. As far as they're concerned, they just come up with an incredibly crude formula which applies to every country in the world. And they've applied, as Trump said, 10% across the board. It doesn't matter whether you're in surplus or a deficit with us. It's 10%. We're not allowing anything in under 10% tariff. So as the penguins say, we might well be taking our business elsewhere. And countries faced with these levels of tariffs, particularly China, will be looking elsewhere to sell their goods, perhaps, rather than into the US. And that's why this tariff program, designed to end the deficit, at least that's the position of the White House, is not going to work. For the first reason, there'll be retaliation from other trading nations. There already has been. China has just upped its tariffs every time they've faced increases from the United States. Other countries have imposed tariffs and are considering them. Even the EU, even the vassal state of the European Union, is considering tariffs on US tech exports at the present moment, unless some measures reductions take place and a deal is made. And they can consider that because US trade, imports and exports, are no longer the decisive force in world trade. They still have a share of around about US exports is around about 13% of the world exports. It's not small. It's the second largest, but that compares to 35% of world exports in China. And the EU and Japan and others also have sizable shares of world exports. The US is not the dominant trading nation of the world that it was after the end of the Second World War into the 50s and 60s. And it's also not the dominant manufacturing power anymore. I'll come to that in a minute. So it is possible for other countries to consider alternatives to trading with the United States, to expand their trade elsewhere. There have been some estimates that if everybody switched their trade to somewhere else and didn't export to the US, it would take them about 3 to 5 years for the major trading nations who did that to re-establish their shares and their export levels over a period of time if they didn't export at all to the United States. So it's possible. Of course, it's painful, but it could be done. So the US policy, Trump's policy, is likely to fail for that reason. But the main reason it's going to fail is because it doesn't solve the problem of the US economy and the fact that it's in a stagnating state. The United States grew last year to 2.5% in real GDP. That's an increase of 2.5% in the national output in real terms after taking into account inflation. That's better than anywhere else in the top 7 capitalist economies in Europe and Japan and the UK. Virtually no growth in those countries at all in 2024, or at the most 1%. So the US is doing relatively better, better than the UK, better than Europe. But in compared to what its growth rate used to be, even in the 21st century, before the Great Recession in 2008, when it was 3 to 4% a year, it's way, way down. And already, even before Trump introduced these tariff measures, there were signs that it was slowing down significantly in 2025. The estimates now are that it's likely to be in the first quarter of this year, and this is before the tariffs have really been applied, it's going to be growing at maybe just 0.3% in the first quarter just gone in March 2025. And a lot of estimates now saying that the maximum growth rate this year will be around about 1 or even under 1%, so half of the rate in 2024. And that's before the tariffs really bite, so if they continue as they are now. So the US domestic economy is in difficulty, and introducing tariffs on imports coming into the country is not going to improve the situation. It's going to make it worse. It will mean that the components and things that US manufacturers and other services sectors don't have. It will mean that prices will rise for households and manufacturers because the tariffs will increase the prices of imports if they need them. If they can't use anything else, they're going to have to buy them at very high prices. So this is likely to drive up inflation. And that's the real reason why this process won't work. I suspect that by this time next year, that deficit on the trade that we've been looking at now will have hardly been shifted downwards at all by the policies introduced by Trump. And why is America in a stagnating position? Why has Trump felt he needs to force this policy on the rest of the world? It's not because China is cheating on the US or Europe's cheating on the US. Trump said this week that Europe's been screwing us for decades. Well, this is sheer nonsense. That the point has happened over the last 40 or 50 years is that American companies have shifted their manufacturing base out of the United States into the rest of the world, first into Europe, but mainly, eventually, into the so-called global south, in particular China and Asia and so on, and elsewhere, where they got cheap labor, so wages were low, and they could introduce the latest technologies which didn't require so much labor, so they could get rid of American trade union positions and wages in the US and really make a much better profit. And so that's why this process has taken place. So in doing that, they then transferred the manufacturing power, technology, knowledge to outside of the United States into the hands, particularly in the case of China, which didn't accept just foreign companies coming in and operating with no control. On the contrary, they insisted on at least 50% control of those companies and have started to develop their own technology and own manufacturing base. And that is why this situation is developed. If you just look at this map, you see down here, we've got manufacturing share of US employment was around 30% after the Second World War. And during this period, the US is quite happy to have free trade agreements and reduce tariffs. But the thing began to change as it dropped down. Manufacturing share dropped down to near 20% and kept falling. And eventually, we have the position, particularly with China entering the World Trade Organization and entering world markets in a big way from the beginning of this century, we can see that the share of manufacturing in the US economy has fallen below 10% to about 8 or 9%. So that's the number of employees who are actually working in manufacturing sector now in the US. It's no longer, at least domestically, a manufacturing power. It still has a power exporting wise, but not within the US providing jobs. On the other contrast, we have the position where China has taken a huge lead in manufacturing. So if you look at the left-hand graph here, this is the share of production in manufacturing amongst the G7 economies, the top 7 economies. And you can see if we go back to 1995 only, that China was nothing. It was only 5%. Then was the US up there at 20% manufacturing or share of world output, manufacturing output. And then this red line is China rocketing up to 35% now. And as I said earlier, the US has gradually fallen. It's still second at 13%. And basically, countries like Japan, which back in the early days were strong competitors to the US, have fallen away as well. And Europe has remained also ran in the share of world output. This is manufacturing output. So on the right-hand side, you can see it nicely clearly between the top 10 economies, excluding China, which have gone up to 30% of world manufacturing output. That's China, while the top 10 have dropped down to the same level. So just recently then, China now produces more manufacturing goods than the whole of the 10 other countries in the world. That shows the real power in manufacturing sector, the key sector, of course, in economies that China now has. This is the frightening thought for the ruling class within the United States. Something has got to be done about this. And the US has been declining economically in relative terms. If we look in 1974, the first world countries, that's the G7 if you like, had a 60% of world output. Now they've got 44, so they're still by far the largest. If we exclude the ex-Soviet Union countries, you can see they virtually have no role economically in the world scale at the moment. And if we look at the global south, which includes India and most parts of Asia and so on, although India is separated off here a bit, and it's gone from 3% to 8%, but the global south really hasn't really changed. Its share is about 21 to 23% in 2022. So where's the big change? Well, there's the big change. China's gone from just 2% of world output, 2% of world output in 1974 to 22% now. And at that sort of rate of pace, you can see the ratio is going to change even more unless something is done by the powers that be in the imperialist north. That's why we're having this trade war. And this trade war, although it's apparently against the rest of the world on behalf of Trump, is really aimed at China. China is the place that has to be curbed, strangled, ideally dismembered, not only economically, but eventually politically, so that America can be great again and rule the world with the support of its junior partners in the global north, with the destruction of the Chinese economy and political development that it's achieved over the last 70 years, in the same way that they defeated the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. That's really the long-term aim. And this is just, first of all, a program to try and squeeze China above all apart from the other countries and place the United States back at the top of the race, as it were. What this is going to do, in my opinion, is increase very likely a new slump in the world economy before the end of this decade. First of all, we've seen, as I think Ray mentioned earlier, he's been looking at bond yields, but we've seen a dramatic volatility developing amongst financial asset prices. The stock market, after Trump's tariff increases, fell 20%. It recovered a little bit, but it's still well down. Now, that 20% sounds huge, but of course, you've had to remember that it's had 4 or 5 years of just upward growth continually over the recent period. So the 20% fall is still fairly little compared to where it was, say, 4 or 5 years ago. But there's every possibility that it will fall further, particularly if corporate profits begin to decline and fail because of rising costs as a result. So, and at the same time, it's starting to squeeze government bond prices, which are key to maintaining a stability in the credit markets, and that's shown a sign. So those of us in Britain know about Liz Truss trying to do something similar, which led to a huge drop in bond prices, which the Bank of England had to intervene on. That is also a risk that could appear in the United States. And as I say, corporate profits are grinding to a halt. They already were slowing down before these events took place. And now we can imagine that this tariffs tantrum is going to produce a similar extension of that decline in corporate profits growth, perhaps towards zero by the end of this year. And as I say, global debt now is at record levels, about $327 trillion globally, about 250% of world GDP, at record levels, particularly in poor countries who are in serious debt distress. If interest rates and inflation come back and growth and profits fall, then a lot of countries and companies are going to be in serious trouble over the next year or so. How long that will take to appear remains to be seen. Mentioned this, I think, in many other occasions, that in the major capitalist economies, there are about 20% of companies that are zombies. They're called zombies because they're walking dead. What do we mean? We mean that they don't earn enough profit even to pay their debt bills. They can't pay the interest on their debt. So how do they pay it? They borrow more money from the banks, and the banks lend it to them because they don't want them to go bust. So they're building up more and more debt, and they're still not making any profit. So these companies basically don't do anything. They employ a few people, they produce things, they don't make any profit, they can't invest, they just tick along. And that share of companies in the major economies has been gradually increasing over the last few years. So if we get an increase in inflation supposedly come down, it's still not down to the targets set by the central banks of a 2% a year, but it's come down from the big figures we saw in 2022 of 8 to 10% a year. But if the United States is going to find that their price of goods in the shops and imports from US manufacturing and services rising, and inflation starts going back up again, then the Federal Reserve is going to have to consider to increase rates to try and control inflation, or ostensibly to control it. We won't be able to do that. The result will be that interest rates will rise, bond yields will rise, bond prices therefore will fall, there'll be a credit squeeze, and that could all add to this risk of another slump before the end of the decade, and maybe by the end of this year. I don't want to predict too much. So what is the alternative for the big capitalist economies and their governments in this situation of a possible slump, of a trade dislocation, of increased inflation, of slowing growth? They're looking to solve the question by obviously making welfare cuts, reducing what they pay out in government services. Already Trump has got his friend Elon Musk to wield a chainsaw into government services in the United States, with thousands of workers being sacked. It won't make a lot of difference to the overall spending figures. On the other hand, while cutting welfare in order to get more tax cuts, one thing is not being cut, and that is spending on arms and the defense as it's so called. Trump has announced that this year, the United States administration will spend $1 trillion on arms spending in order to build up its forces for future struggle. And the United, as we know, across the water in the European Union, they are all committed now to raising their defense spending as a share of GDP from about just under 2% a year to 3 or 4 or 5%. And our own Prime Minister is pledged to do that, to raise it to 2.5% by 2027 and then on up to 3%. So this is the one big pledge that Prime Minister Starmer has in spending more, and that's on arms. And this is not accidental. The purpose of this exercise is twofold. One, to perhaps provide some profits for arms manufacturers, but more importantly, to build up the forces of the major capitalist economies, the imperialist economies, in order to deal with any resistance that may emerge in the rest of the world against the policies which Trump and the European Union want to present. And so we're now in a position where we have war already in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And so far, Trump has been unable to bang heads together to get a deal there. But even if we get an agreement between Russia and Ukraine over the next year or so, it's quite clear that the EU nations are preparing a major defense force and armaments and general position of what they call a defense line to protect themselves from the inevitable invasion that Putin is going to launch once the peace is achieved with Ukraine. Well, that will be the excuse. What it means is surrounding Russia and looking, as the foreign minister of the EU said, looking to dismember Russia and to reduce it to 20 small states, which can be easily managed. That is one of the political aims of these people now running the EU foreign policy. And of course, over in Asia, which is where Trump wants to go, and this is the point I think we want to make strategically, that Trump appears to be not interested in what's going on in Europe. He's going to leave that to the European imperialist powers. He's interested in, first of all, establishing America great again and establishing complete and solid and unopposed control of the Americas, both North and South. So Greenland will come in, the Panama Canal will be operated by the United States, and Canada will be inevitably annexed. At least that's the Trump dream. And that, of course, South America, nobody can step out of line there in the course of any American policy that's to be adopted. And if that's solidified in what used to be called the Monroe Doctrine back in the early 19th century by the first American presidents, he will then look across the Pacific, across to Asia, just as they did in the 1930s, to look across and take on Japan, a rising capitalist power in the 1920s, which led to the intervention of the United States and Japan into the war and making a global war. And the same sort of look towards the Pacific, in particular towards China this time, now that Japan is a vassal state, and to use the provocation possibly of Taiwan as the basis for trying to strangle and weaken the Chinese economy and even maybe take military action. That's the risk we have ahead of us, it seems to me, and that is rather a frightening thought to lead us from just the circus of Trump's tantrums to the possibility of outright military conflict in Asia.